And this is one more image of the gray and white matter differentiation. And this is a proton density weighted MRI scan. You're not able to visualize this in e-anatomy. They don't have proton density, but they do have flare, which is very similar in its differentiation of the white and gray matter. So do take a look at the flare images as well, and they may help you in studying your deep set gray matter. But here you have the cortex in a very light gray, and the very light gray of the deep set gray matter as well. And then the darker gray in this one is the white matter tracks. And the white matter connects the right and left hemispheres, as well as in superior and inferior tracks. These actually look like they're running posterior to anterior, which they generally do, but they also are in an superior to inferior tract as well, and we're going to see that on some coronal images, as well as taking a look at the white matter tracts within the brain on some illustrations. This is a mapping of the white matter tracts in the brain, and I just think this is so cool. You can take a look at Google Images or Bing Images and just look up white matter tracts of the brain and then click on images, and you'll see all sorts of images that are similar to this. And although we are looking at a sagittal image with this being the anterior and this being the posterior, so that you can't see the right to left connections, you can see superior to inferior and how the white matter tracts run, as well as the anterior to posterior as well, and there's some anterior to posterior here as well. So it's just interesting to look at it and to see how the white matter is just sort of diffuse within our brains, and they're really neat images. This uses a diffusion technique in MRI. So let's take a look at our white matter tracts, and on the exams I'll want you to be specific about which white matter tract that you are pointing out, and I will tell you about those as we go along here. The first one is the corpus callosum, and it's a rather large white matter tract that connects the right and left hemispheres of the brain. So the rostrum is here. This is the very tip, an extension off of this anterior bend. And this is the last thing to develop in the white matter tracts. And then the genu, which is just another name for bend, that's the anterior bend or genu. And then you get into the body or the trunk here, superiorly. And then posterior to that is the splenium, and that is the posterior bend. And the genu is anterior to the septum pellucidum and the third ventricle. And then the splenium is posterior to the third ventricle. We also have the anterior commissure, which is a left to right connection in the brain, and we'll be able to see that on a coronal image even better. And then the posterior commissure, which also, again, we'll see that a little bit better in coronal images, although it is not always seen as well as the anterior commissure. So here is a midline netter's view of that same image, and you can see the corpus callosum here, and the anterior portion, the genu, and the rostrum here, which is that extension of the genu, and then the body, or the central area, and the splenium posteriorly. And this corpus callosum runs along the superior border of the lateral ventricles, and then the central sulcus and that falx comes down just to the border of the corpus callosum to separate the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. Here you can see the anterior commissure, which is that left-right connection of the brain through white matter, and then the posterior commissure here. And there's three areas here that are kind of important to us. The posterior commissure, which is just anterior to the pineal gland, and it is just superior to the tectal plate. So tectal plate is here, or also quadrigeminal plate. And then superior to that is the posterior commissure, and posterior to the posterior commissure is the pineal gland. This coronal illustration from e-anatomy shows the corpus callosum nicely. So this is a corpus callosum here, and as you recall, it runs along the superior border of the lateral ventricles. So here's the lateral ventricles here, the right anterior horn of the lateral ventricle and the left anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, as well as the third ventricle. and the corpus callosum connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain, superior to that. We have some other white matter tracks here that we're going to be studying soon. This is the internal capsule that runs in between the gray matter and the thalamus, and the gray matter and the caudate nucleus. This is caudate nucleus here. And then we have the external capsule, which is just lateral to the basal ganglia. And then we have the extreme capsule here, which is just lateral to, lateral to this area here, which is called the claustrum. So internal capsule, external capsule, and then extreme capsule here. I'll use this T2 weighted axial image to show you the white matter tracks because it's nicely labeled, but the image from e-anatomy actually has slightly better contrast, and so that will help you in differentiating the white matter tracks and the deep set gray matter. So when you take a look at this image, this is anterior and this is right. And so you've got the right and left hemispheres of the brain. You've got the genu of the corpus callosum here. So that is anterior to the frontal horns of the lateral ventricles. And then you have the splenium of the corpus callosum, and it looks like we've lost the arrow on this one, I'm sorry, but this is the splenium of the corpus callosum here. And this is posterior to the third ventricle and between the occipital horns of the lateral ventricles, and that's the splenium of the corpus callosum. And then you have the deep set gray matter just lateral to the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles. You have the head of the caudate nucleus. So this is the left head of the caudate nucleus and the right head of the caudate nucleus. And the caudate nucleus follows the same shape as the lateral ventricles, and we're going to see that shortly. Then you have the third ventricle here, and the thalamus sits on each side of the third ventricle. So you have the left side of the thalamus and the right side of the thalamus. And then you have the lentiform nucleus, and the lentiform nucleus is actually made up of two portions. There's a putamen, which is easily seen in this image. It's a little bit lighter gray here, and it's kind of almost lens-shaped on either side, and that's the putamen, and then just deep to that is a caudate nucleus, and we aren't seeing that as well, but we will on an image later in the slide lecture. And then the white matter tracks, this is the internal capsule here, and it makes a V shape. So it comes down in between the lentiform nucleus and the thalamus here, and in between the lentiform nucleus and the head of the caudate. So this is the anterior limb, this is the genu. It's a little turn here, just like the genu of the corpus callosum. It's a bend or a turn, and this is the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So anterior, genu, and posterior limb of the internal capsule on the right side. And then this is the external capsule, just external to the putamen. And this is all on the right side of the patient, and then the same thing on the left. And I think we've covered all of it. The only thing I did not show you is that when we were talking about the anterior and posterior commissure, I mentioned that the anterior commissure is anterior to the third ventricle, but I did not mention that it's almost directly superior from the sella or the pituitary gland. And I'm going to go back up just a couple of slides and show you that here. Yep, so here's your anterior commissure. It is anterior to the third ventricle and then almost directly superior to the sella and the sella turcica here and the pituitary gland. So you can see this contrast of this T2 weighted axial image is slightly better than the one that was in the previous slide, and we're able to make out the internal capsule a lot better. We're still not quite as able to see the globus pallidus, and we'll show it to you here in this image, but in a later slide I do have a proton density weighted image that really does define that well. So these are just slightly different levels. You can see the genu of the corpus callosum here, but you don't see it on this illustration from e-anatomy. So here is the genu of the corpus callosum and the splenium of the corpus callosum. You have the lateral ventricles here, the left lateral ventricle, anterior horn, the third ventricle, and the posterior horn, or the occipital or posterior horn. And then you have the head of the caudate nucleus and just a little wisp of the tail of the caudate nucleus here on either side. And here you're seeing it on the illustration, just the tail. And the tail becomes very, very small of the caudate nucleus. So it is a little bit harder to see that on the images. Sometimes you can make it out and sometimes not. But this is part of the deep set basal ganglia, as well as the putamen, and this is easily seen here, this triangular shaped piece, or almost kind of like a sail, I guess, on either side. And then you have the internal capsule. So you have the anterior limb, and then the genu and the posterior limb of the internal capsule on the right, and the anterior, genu, and posterior limb of the internal capsule on the left. And then you have the external capsule that is just lateral to the putamen here, or also called the lentiform nucleus, because the putamen and the globus pallidus together form the lentiform nucleus. And here, after the external capsule, you can just make out the claustrum there, and then external to that would be the extreme capsule, but that is really hard to make out in this image. Here it's a little bit easier. So you have the head of the caudate nucleus on the left and on the right, and the tail of the caudate nucleus just anterior to that occipital horn, or just anterior to the trigone area here of the occipital lobes. And then you have the lentiform nucleus. So on the left here, the lentiform nucleus is this whole area of deep set gray matter, and it is the putamen here. The darker area, the one that's easier to see, is the putamen, and then these two smaller areas here are the globus pallidus. So this is a lentiform nucleus on the left and the lentiform nucleus on the right. And then you have the claustrum on the left and the claustrum on the right. Then the white matter tracts are the anterior limb, the genu, and the posterior limb of the internal capsule, the external capsule, and then the extreme capsule that is lateral to the claustrum. And once again, this is the splenium of the corpus callosum, but you don't see the genu of the corpus callosum on that particular slice. So this is the proton density image that I kept promising you, that shows you the differentiation in gray matter with better detail than some of the other images that we have. And you can see how the lateral ventricles in the CSF don't show up as well in this type of image. You can make them out, but they're just not as easily seen. Sorry about that. But the gray matter is more easily seen. So you've got the gray matter of the cortex, the deep set, or the white matter tracts, and then the deep set gray matter. Here's the head of the caudate nucleus on the right and on the left. You've got the putamen of the lentiform nucleus and the globus pallidus on the left and on the right. And then more easily seen on the right side is the claustrum. You see that claustrum there. So then internal to that would be the external capsule, and then lateral to that would be the extreme capsule. So it's just better seen here on this proton density weighted image. And because the patient might be slightly tilted, you're seeing it better on the right than on the left. Also here you can see just a little wisp of the head of the, the tail of the caudate nucleus right in front of the trigone area of the lateral ventricles. So just take a look at that image. It's a really nice one for seeing the globus pallidus, which we don't always see in some of the other images. So once again, going from outside to inside, you've got the lateral to medial. So once again, going from lateral to medial, we'll start on the right side since that's better image. You've got the temporal lobe, you've got the sylvian fissure, and the insula or the insular lobe that's deep to that. Medial to the insula is the extreme capsule. Medial to the extreme capsule is the claustrum. Medial to that is the external capsule. And then medial to that is the putamen, which is the most lateral portion of the lentiform nucleus. Medial to the putamen is the globus pallidus, which is the most medial portion of the lentiform nucleus. Medial to that is the internal capsule, the anterior horn, the genu, and the posterior horn. Medial to the internal capsule is the head of the caudate nucleus and the thalamus, and then medial to that is the third ventricle. The anterior limb, the genu, and the posterior limb, and then medial to the internal capsule is the head of the caudate nucleus, and then the thalamus, and medial to that is the third ventricle. This illustration from e-anatomy shows nicely the shape of the lateral ventricles and how the caudate nucleus follows that same shape and just curves along the lateral and sometimes the anterior edge of the lateral ventricles. So this is the head of the caudate nucleus following the frontal horn of the lateral ventricles. And you remember the head of the caudate nucleus is just lateral to that frontal horn of the lateral ventricles. And then it follows along the shape of the body of the lateral ventricles. It tucks inside anteriorly to the trigone, so it's anterior of the trigone, and then it rests superiorly on the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. And then you have the amygdaloid body here at the end, or the amygdaloid complex. And then you can also see how the lentiform nucleus sits just a little bit lateral to the caudate nucleus. As it goes up and around, it's also inferior to the caudate nucleus when you're at the body portion of the caudate nucleus, but it's posterior and slightly lateral to the head of the caudate nucleus. And then deep to that is the thalamus, which is in purple here, and then deep to the thalamus would be the third ventricle. And this is just a nice illustration to show you how everything is placed within that ventricular system. And to end this portion of the lecture, I want to show you a couple nice coronal images from e-anatomy. This is from the 3D brain that shows you a little bit higher resolution and all in T1 weighted images. On this image on the left, we are in the body portion of the body or trunk portion of the corpus callosum, and you can see how the white matter track crosses from right to left and left to right here, just superior to the lateral ventricles. And we are almost getting into the third ventricle here, and the pituitary gland. We're just a little bit anterior of the body of the pituitary gland and the third ventricle. So anterior to that is the anterior commissure, and you can see that right to left tract right here. That's really nice to see. I couldn't get a good image from e-anatomy of the posterior commissure, but I wanted to show you an image further back where you can see the splenium of the corpus callosum crossing right to left. We are getting close. We're just getting into the cerebellum here, so you can see the cerebellum and the brainstem. So we are posterior now to the third ventricle, but we are not in an area to see the posterior commissure. And that will be our white and gray matter and cerebral hemispheres lecture.